Hello, I'm Michelle with Mystic Moon Shop, if you don't know that already. I just wanted to talk about gauges. Gauges of earrings, nose rings, etc. Nose rings. Typically, the smallest, thinnest nose ring we make is a 26 gauge. The next one up is a 24 gauge. The next one up is a 22 gauge. So the higher the number, the smaller the gauge. We make 20 gauge, 18 gauge, and 16 gauge. Sometimes 14 gauge. Septum rings are typically either 16 or 14 gauge. They pierce those pretty large. 26 gauge is really super delicate. It's a very delicate nose ring, and it is not an earring. It won't hold up in an earring. It's way too thin. 24 gauge is a little more sturdy, and it still is not really good for ears. Great for nose. If you want a really discreet, delicate look, it's perfect. But I wouldn't recommend 26 or 24 gauge in an earring. The smallest that I would go in a cartilage piercing or any type of earring would be a 22 gauge. They will hold up really well in ears. 20 gauge is a standard earring. If you can walk into a JCPenney's or a Macy's or wherever, whatever store you're going to, and you can buy hoops off the counter and put them in your ears and they fit, then it's 20 gauge. If you were pierced with a gun, you would be a 20 gauge. If you were pierced with a gun and you've had your piercings for a long time and they're kind of stretched out, kind of weak, you can go up to an 18 gauge. But I would not recommend going up to a 16 gauge unless they're extremely stretched out. So 20 gauge is the standard. Any gun piercing is done in a 20 gauge. If you went to a tattoo parlor and you were you were pierced in a tattoo parlor, you could be any gauge. Different piercers pierce with different gauges. Tragus typically are pierced with 18 or 16 gauge, but there is no rhyme or reason. You may go to a piercer and they may pierce you with an 18 gauge or a 14 gauge. It's kind of up to the piercer. So if you don't know what your gauge is, you can always call the place that pierced you and ask them what they used on you. They should have a record of it, or they should have a fairly specific standard. But 20 gauge is your standard earring size. It's 20 gauge. 18 gauge if they're stretched out. If you're doing a cartilage, cartilage tends to be really sensitive. And sometimes it doesn't do well with an 18 or 20 gauge because it's so stiff. 22 gauge works really good in cartilage piercings. That's pretty much about it. Nose piercings, lower gauges. Some people have very thick gauges in nose piercings. But again, if you don't know what your gauge is, either measure the ring that you have or the stud that you have, or call the place and find out what your gauge is. There was something else I was going to tell you, and I can't remember what it was. Anyway, I hope that's explanatory, and I hope that you understand it. If you don't understand it, email me. I'll be happy to answer any questions and help with sizing, whatever I can do. Thank you much.